He called the cops on him, thinking he could get him arrested, but moments later, he learned the man he reported was the sheriff of the entire county. The night it all began was unnaturally still, the kind of heavy silence that makes you feel like the air itself is holding its breath. A cool breeze drifted down Oakwood Lane, rustling the maple trees that lined the street and carrying with it the faint hum of streetlights. Most of the neighborhood was winding down for the night, windows dimming one by one, dogs settling into quiet corners. But at the end of the cul-de-sac, in front of our house, everything was about to explode into chaos. It started with the sirens, low at first, then growing louder and closer until they shattered the calm like glass. Their flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, washing over lawns and driveways as 3 police cruisers roared around the corner and screeched to a halt in front of our home. The sound jolted the neighborhood awake. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, faces pressed against windows, curious and confused. And there he was, Leonard Branson, president of the Oakwood Estates HOA, standing at the edge of our driveway like a general about to witness a victory. Arms folded over his chest, lips curled into that trademark smirk of his, Leonard radiated smug satisfaction. He had waited weeks for this moment, maybe months. "There they are," he announced loudly, jabbing a finger toward my father, who was sitting calmly on the porch with a cup of tea. "That man is dangerous. Arrest him before he hurts someone." The words hung in the air like poison, and a ripple of murmurs ran through the small crowd that had begun to gather on the sidewalks. Dangerous? My father? It was almost laughable. Sheriff Samuel Hayes, decorated officer, 30 years in law enforcement, a man who'd risked his life to protect people like Leonard, was the last person you'd ever call dangerous. But Leonard wasn't after the truth. He was after humiliation. He wanted to make an example out of us. My father didn't move. He didn't rise from his chair or speak a single word. He simply watched Leonard with the calm, unblinking gaze of a man who had seen far worse storms than this one. His silence made Leonard angrier. "Do your job," Leonard barked at the officers, his voice sharp and impatient. "You're wasting time." The lead officer, a younger man who looked more nervous than authoritative, approached cautiously. "Sir," he said to my father, "we received a report of a disturbance here tonight. We're going to need to see some identification." My father set his cup down with deliberate care and reached for his wallet. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He simply handed over his badge and ID card. The officer glanced down and froze. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. He swallowed hard, then looked up at my father with something between disbelief and alarm. "Sheriff Hayes, sir, I didn't realize." Leonard frowned, confused by the officer's sudden change in tone. "What's wrong?" he demanded. "Why are you hesitating? Arrest him already." The officer turned toward Leonard, his posture now rigid and formal. "Mr. Branson," he said carefully, "the man you're referring to is Sheriff Samuel Hayes. He's the chief law enforcement officer for this entire county." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the breeze seemed to stop. Leonard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The smirk that had been glued to his face for the last 10 minutes flickered, then vanished altogether. "That's impossible," he stammered, taking a small step back. "He's lying. He's just trying to intimidate you." The officer shook his head. "No, sir. I've seen this badge before. He's our sheriff. And unless you have a lawful reason for calling us here, we need to have a serious conversation about filing a false report." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered neighbors. The balance of power in that driveway shifted in an instant. Leonard had walked into this night expecting to destroy a man's reputation. Instead, he had just picked a fight with the most powerful law enforcement figure in the county. But Leonard, stubborn and prideful as always, wasn't ready to surrender. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice rising. "He threatened me. He's been violating HOA rules for months. Sheriff or not, he's not above the law." My father rose slowly from his chair, straightening his shoulders as he stepped down from the porch. At 6 feet tall, with a steady, commanding presence, he didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. "You're absolutely right, Leonard," he said, his tone calm and measured. "No one is above the law. That's why I find it curious that you've made a false police report tonight. I didn't, Leonard began, but my father didn't stop. That's why I also find it interesting, he continued, taking a slow step closer, that someone matching your description was seen tampering with my property last week, and that several neighbors have reported harassment, intimidation, and falsified violation notices, all with your signature. Leonard's face turned crimson. You can't prove any of that. Maybe not yet, my father replied, eyes narrowing slightly. But give it time. The tension in the air was electric. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or let the confrontation unfold. Leonard shifted on his feet, his earlier confidence crumbling with every passing second. And then, just when it seemed like the night might finally settle into silence, something unexpected happened. One of the officers stepped forward, holding a tablet connected to their dispatch system. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "we just got a ping from the county database. There's already an open inquiry involving this HOA, potential misuse of funds, and harassment complaints." The words hit Leonard like a blow to the chest. "What?" he hissed. "Who filed that?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Leonard's eyes darted toward my father, and for the first time, there was something new in them. Fear. "Leonard," my father said quietly, "I've spent 3 decades enforcing the law. I've seen men ruin themselves because they believed rules didn't apply to them. Don't be one of those men." But Leonard couldn't help himself. His pride wouldn't allow it. "You think you can scare me?" he spat. "I run this neighborhood. I make the rules here. And I'm not going anywhere." My father didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back up the porch steps, as if Leonard's words carried no weight at all. That, more than anything, enraged the HOA president. He shouted after him, words tumbling out in a mix of anger and desperation. But the damage was already done. The crowd had seen everything. The police had witnessed his arrogance firsthand. And the story of how Leonard called the cops on the county sheriff would spread through Oakwood Estates like wildfire before morning. As the cruisers eventually pulled away and the crowd dispersed, Leonard remained rooted to the edge of the driveway, his mind clearly racing. He had wanted to humiliate my father. Instead, he had humiliated himself in front of the entire neighborhood. And worse, he had drawn law enforcement attention to his activities. The gears of something much larger had begun to turn that night, gears that Leonard couldn't stop even if he tried. Inside the house, my father closed the door behind him and let out a quiet sigh. "This isn't over," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. But he just made the biggest mistake of his life. And outside, under the dim glow of the streetlight, Leonard stood alone, the king of a crumbling kingdom, too blinded by pride to realize that his downfall had already begun. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave with one arrogant decision? That was the night Leonard started digging his, and he had no idea just how deep it would go. The morning after the police incident, Oakwood Estates buzzed with more gossip than a courtroom hallway. Word spread fast. Leonard Branson, the almighty HOA president, had called the police on Sheriff Samuel Hayes himself. Neighbors whispered about it in hushed tones on their morning walks, some half laughing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. But if anyone thought the embarrassment might humble Leonard, they underestimated just how deeply his arrogance ran. Leonard didn't hide. He strutted down the street that morning as though nothing had happened, chin high and clipboard in hand. The man had mastered the art of turning humiliation into bluster. "Misunderstanding," he muttered to anyone who dared bring up the previous night. "Just doing my duty." Yet, behind the forced smile and clipped explanations, there was a simmering rage in his eyes, a fury born of humiliation and bruised pride. And when a man like Leonard felt humiliated, he didn't retreat. He doubled down. Leonard's rise to power in Oakwood Estates had been slow but deliberate. Years before, he had been a small-time real estate agent whose company collapsed under a pile of bad investments. He lost everything: his business, his reputation, and nearly his home. Oakwood was supposed to be his reset button, a quiet place to rebuild his life. But Leonard couldn't stand the idea of living like everyone else. He needed control, and the HOA was the perfect tool. It started with a campaign. He volunteered for a board seat, then worked his way up to president with promises of order and value protection. The first few months were relatively mild. A few new regulations about lawn maintenance, a small increase in dues. But once Leonard secured power, he wielded it like a weapon. He fined one neighbor, Mr. Carter, for having the wrong shade of mulch, a $150 violation because it was too red. Another, Mr. Patel, received a written warning for leaving his trash bin out for 20 minutes past collection time. Leonard even fined a retired firefighter for hanging a small American flag that was an inch too large for the community standard. It wasn't about the rules. It was about dominance. Each petty enforcement made Leonard feel like a king, and soon he wasn't just enforcing rules. He was creating new ones, dozens of them, designed to keep everyone beneath his thumb. And then he set his sights on the one man he couldn't control, Samuel Hayes. From the start, Leonard resented my father's presence. He hated the way people greeted him with respect. He hated that the sheriff didn't flinch at his threats. Most of all, he hated that my father didn't need to impress anyone. It gnawed at Leonard. This man who lived quietly, paid his dues on time, and yet commanded more authority without trying than Leonard ever could. The campaign against us began subtly. First came the violation notices, a claim that our fence was too tall, even though it matched the exact HOA specifications, followed by a warning that our mailbox was improperly painted. My father responded politely each time, with documentation proving compliance. Leonard backed off, briefly, only to return with new tactics. One afternoon, a letter arrived claiming we owed $2,450 in maintenance assessments for landscaping services that had never been performed. My father called the HOA office directly. "There must be a mistake," he said calmly over the phone. "We've never approved any such charges." "No mistake," Leonard's clipped voice replied. "The board voted on it. Pay within 30 days or face a lien on your property." "Then I'll need a copy of that vote and the service contract," my father said evenly. There was a long pause. "You're questioning the board's authority?" Leonard snapped. "I'm requesting documentation," my father replied. "Surely that's standard procedure." The documents never arrived. Instead, another violation appeared, this time accusing us of unauthorized surveillance equipment. Leonard had decided our security cameras were unsightly and threatened fines unless we removed them. My father refused. The very next week, we discovered one of the cameras had been tampered with, the lens scratched and the wires partially cut. A quiet rage flickered behind my father's eyes as he examined the damage. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was filing the incident away in the mental ledger he'd been building since Leonard's first stunt. Meanwhile, Leonard's grip on the neighborhood tightened. He patrolled the streets at night, flashlight in hand, jotting down infractions in his little notebook. He demanded homeowners remove basketball hoops from driveways, repaint mailboxes, even change curtain colors visible from the street. He cited aesthetic integrity as justification for his obsession. Most neighbors complied out of fear. Those who didn't quickly found themselves buried under fines, threats of legal action, or visits from Leonard himself. But cracks were beginning to show. It started with whispers, a rumor that Leonard had been using HOA funds for consulting fees paid to a company no one had ever heard of. Another neighbor claimed Leonard had shown up on his property late at night, snapping photos without permission. A third found his backyard gate mysteriously broken after refusing to repaint his home's trim. And then there was the night Mr. Kim, a quiet engineer who lived 2 doors down, confronted Leonard at a board meeting. "Where's the annual financial report?" Mr. Kim demanded. "It's required by law. We haven't received one in over 2 years." Leonard brushed it off. "We're consolidating records. It'll be ready when it's ready." But the doubt had been planted. People were starting to question him. Leonard's paranoia grew. He started holding closed-door meetings with board members, locking the office door during work hours, and threatening legal action against anyone who defamed the HOA. And yet, he still couldn't stop himself from targeting us. It was as though undermining Sheriff Hayes had become his personal mission, a way to prove that even the county's top lawman was subject to his authority. One afternoon, as my father mowed the lawn, Leonard pulled up in his silver SUV and stepped out with his clipboard. He approached the property line with the swagger of a man who believed he owned the ground beneath his feet. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I notice your grass is half an inch higher than regulation height. That's a $75 fine." My father shut off the mower and leaned casually against the handle. "Half an inch," he repeated. "You measure?" Leonard smiled thinly. "I don't have to. I can see it." "Then I suggest you get your eyes checked," my father said mildly, "because it's exactly 2 inches as required." Leonard's smile faltered. "Watch yourself," he hissed. "You think your badge makes you untouchable, but here, you follow my rules." "Is that so?" my father asked. His tone didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a flicker of quiet warning that Leonard didn't notice. "Well, I'll be sure to remember that." Leonard stormed off, furious that his attempt to rattle my father had failed. But in his rage, he made a mistake. He left behind the clipboard he'd been carrying. Inside were pages of notes, some about violations, others far more troubling. One page in particular stood out, a list of homeowners who had challenged Leonard, each with handwritten notes beside their names. Words like watch, pressure, and target leapt off the page. My father slipped the page into an envelope and tucked it away. He didn't confront Leonard about it. He didn't say a word, but I could see the shift in his posture. The sheriff wasn't just annoyed now, he was watching. Leonard's arrogance blinded him to the danger he was courting. In his mind, he was invincible. The HOA board was loyal to him. The bylaws were his shield, and the fear he sowed kept everyone in line. He believed he had Samuel Hayes cornered. What he didn't know was that every petty act, every false fine, every illegal stunt was quietly being documented. And with every arrogant decision Leonard made, he was tightening the noose around his own neck. By late summer, Oakwood Estates no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a kingdom ruled by a petty tyrant. But kingdoms built on fear rarely last, and cracks were spreading faster than Leonard could patch them. Neighbors were growing restless. Questions were piling up. And behind the scenes, my father was laying the groundwork for something Leonard couldn't even imagine. Leonard thought he was untouchable. He thought the sheriff was just another homeowner under his thumb. But he was wrong, dangerously wrong. And as autumn crept closer, so did the consequences he had spent years believing would never come. He just didn't know it yet. The night was quiet when it happened, too quiet for a neighborhood that usually hummed with the sound of sprinklers and crickets after dark. The moon hung low over the cul-de-sac, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. But beneath that calm, something sinister was unfolding. 3 figures crept along the side of our house, dressed in dark clothes and whispering in hurried tones. At their lead was Leonard. He moved with the arrogance of someone who believed he owned everything his eyes touched. Even in the dim light, his sharp features were unmistakable. The neatly trimmed beard, the self-satisfied smirk, the polished loafers that didn't belong on someone skulking through a neighbor's yard after midnight. Behind him followed 2 HOA board members, jittery and glancing over their shoulders as if their nerves knew what Leonard's pride did not. This was a mistake that would change everything. "Cut it here," Leonard whispered, pointing to the junction box near the back porch. One of the men hesitated. "Are you sure about this? It's breaking the law." Leonard turned slowly, his voice a low hiss. "It's enforcing compliance. Those lights don't meet the neighborhood's approved standards. We're just correcting that." The man swallowed hard but obeyed. A faint snap echoed through the still night as the wire was severed, plunging the back of our property into darkness. Leonard's smile widened. "Perfect," he murmured. "Now, if they fix it, they'll be admitting fault. And if they don't," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Inside the house, my father stirred. Years of disciplined habits meant he rarely slept deeply. A flicker from the security monitor on his nightstand caught his eye, a glitch, a brief signal drop from the backyard camera. His brows furrowed. Cameras didn't just cut out without reason. He slipped out of bed and moved silently through the hallway, careful not to wake me. At the back door, he paused and scanned the yard. Everything looked still, but the darkness felt different, heavier, deliberate. He made a note of the time and checked the footage. Sure enough, the feed had gone dark at exactly 12:43 a.m. Interesting, he muttered, his mind already spinning. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He knew this wasn't random vandalism. This was part of a larger pattern, and patterns could be documented. Patterns could bring down tyrants. The next morning, Leonard was already strutting through the neighborhood like a peacock, sunglasses perched on his nose, clipboard in hand. He stopped in front of our property, feigning concern as he pointed at the now-dark fixtures. "These are in violation," he announced loudly, making sure any nearby neighbors could hear. "They'll need to be removed or brought up to code within 72 hours. My father stepped out onto the porch, calm and composed. "Interesting timing, Leonard. Those lights were working perfectly fine last night." Leonard didn't flinch. "Then they weren't compliant last night either. Consider this an official notice." Their eyes locked. Leonard's full of smug superiority. My father's cool and unreadable. Anyone else might have backed down. But my father had spent decades dealing with people who believed power made them untouchable. He knew patience was the deadliest weapon. "Duly noted," he said evenly, then turned back inside. A week later, things escalated. It was a crisp morning when I walked out to check the mail and noticed something strange. The box hung slightly crooked, its lock scratched and bent. When I opened it, the usual neat stack of envelopes was gone. In their place was a single torn flyer from the HOA, one we'd already received weeks ago. "Dad," I called, my voice tight. "You need to see this." He examined the box carefully, his expression hardening. "Tampering," he said, "and not just vandalism. This is federal." The realization hung heavy between us. Whoever had done this wasn't just playing games anymore. They were crossing lines that could land someone in prison. And deep down, we both knew who someone was. We reported the incident, and the postal inspector took photos, dusted for prints, and filed a formal complaint. They didn't promise anything. Cases like this could take time. But even if the investigation stalled, the evidence was now part of a growing file, one that was starting to paint a very clear picture. Leonard, however, seemed to grow bolder with each stunt. He paced around community meetings boasting about enforcing standards and mocked my father indirectly, calling him the neighborhood rebel in front of others. Most residents laughed nervously, unwilling to cross him, but a few exchanged glances, the kind that said they were beginning to question the man they once obeyed. Then came a day Leonard crossed a line he could never uncross. It was a warm afternoon, the sky tinted orange by the setting sun, when Leonard put his final plan into motion. He parked his car directly across from our driveway, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk as if agitated. From our living room window, I watched him glance repeatedly at our house, speaking animatedly into his phone. My father noticed too, but said nothing. He simply continued reading the newspaper, though his eyes flickered occasionally toward the street. Minutes later, Leonard raised his voice, shouting words we couldn't quite hear. Then, as if on cue, he dialed 911. "Here we go," my father muttered under his breath. Leonard paced dramatically, gesturing toward our house. "Yes, officer, it's Leonard Myers, HOA president. I'm in front of a property where the homeowner just threatened me with a weapon. Yes, I fear for my safety." I felt my stomach twist. He's lying. He's actually lying to the police. My father folded the newspaper neatly. He's building his own gallows. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights painted the street as two patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Neighbors peeked through blinds and stepped out onto porches, drawn by the commotion. Leonard stood at the end of the driveway, hands on his hips, a self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Officers," he called, waving them over. "That's him. That's the man who threatened me." The officers approached cautiously, one hand hovering near his holster. "Sir," one said to my father, "we received a report of a threat involving a firearm. We need to speak with you." My father didn't flinch. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and stepped onto the porch. "You're welcome to," he said calmly. "But before we continue, I'd like to make it clear that no such incident occurred." Leonard snorted. Of course he's denying it. That's what guilty people do. The officer shot Leonard a look. "We'll handle this." Then something shifted. One of the officers, a tall man with a graying beard, studied my father more closely. His eyes widened just slightly, and his posture changed. He whispered something to his partner, who also straightened and glanced at my father with a mixture of recognition and respect. "Sir," the first officer asked quietly, "may I confirm your name?" My father nodded and stated it clearly. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. "Understood. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He turned to Leonard, whose grin was already faltering. "We'll be reviewing the details of this call carefully. False reports are a serious matter." Leonard blinked, taken aback. "False? I told you what I saw. He threatened me." "Did you see a weapon?" the officer asked. "Well, no, but did he make a direct threat to your safety?" He looked threatening." "That counts." The officer sighed. "It does not." The neighbors, who had gathered in hushed groups along the sidewalk, were now whispering openly. Leonard's performance was unraveling, and everyone could see it. My father didn't say another word. He simply nodded to the officers, thanked them for their professionalism, and went back inside. Leonard stood there, red-faced and sputtering, his plan crumbling around him. But he wasn't done boasting. Over the next few days, he strutted through the neighborhood like he'd won some great battle. "Had the police here the other night," he'd brag, finally getting that man under control. What he didn't know was that the moment those officers left our driveway, my father had made a call of his own, one that would change the course of everything. "Internal affairs," he said into the phone, his tone steady. "I'd like to report a series of incidents involving harassment, property damage, and a false police report. And I have evidence." It wasn't just one phone call. Over the following days, my father quietly reached out to federal investigators, forwarding security footage, copies of tampering reports, and records of Leonard's threats. He even submitted a detailed timeline of events, including names, dates, and documented violations. Everything Leonard had done, every petty act, every arrogant overstep, was now in official hands. And Leonard, blind to the storm he'd just unleashed, kept digging his hole deeper. He had no idea that his boldest move had just opened the door to his downfall. The neighborhood had returned to its quiet routines, but beneath the surface, a silent war was being waged. Leonard strutted around with the swagger of a man who believed he'd already won, basking in the attention of board members and boasting about how he had put that man in his place. What he didn't realize was that every arrogant word, every petty stunt, and every self-congratulatory speech was being recorded, cataloged, and prepared as ammunition. My father had shifted into a different gear. The night the police lights had faded from our driveway, he stopped reacting and started building. To anyone watching, he looked like the same calm, soft-spoken man he had always been, trimming the hedges, walking the dog, waving to neighbors. But behind closed doors, our dining room had transformed into a command center. The long oak table was buried under stacks of documents, manila folders labeled by date and incident. A corkboard stretched across one wall, covered with printouts of emails, violation notices, photographs, and maps of the neighborhood marked with pins and strings. On the floor, a small portable hard drive blinked silently, a digital vault containing gigabytes of surveillance footage. My father stood at the center of it all, methodical and precise. "Every piece matters," he said quietly, half to himself as he scanned a stack of papers. "No matter how small it seems." He gathered every letter Leonard had sent, notices about non-compliant fencing, fines for unapproved fixtures, even a complaint accusing us of violating noise ordinances because the wind chimes were too loud. Each one was scanned and logged into a spreadsheet with the date, time, and relevant HOA bylaw. Next came the video footage. My father pulled files from our home security system, each one a puzzle piece in Leonard's campaign of harassment. There was the grainy clip of Leonard sneaking around the side of our house at midnight. Another showed him pacing on the sidewalk during the staged disturbance. And yet another caught one of his board members tampering with the edge of our property boundary markers. "This isn't just harassment," my father murmured as he reviewed the footage late one night. "It's conspiracy." Then he went further. He knocked on doors, quietly, politely, and spoke to neighbors who had their own stories. An elderly man down the street shared how Leonard had fined him for planting the wrong variety of flowers. A young couple admitted Leonard had threatened legal action unless they replaced their mailbox post with one matching the approved design. Even those who had once defended Leonard began to share stories they'd never spoken aloud. One evening, a soft knock sounded on our door. It was Mr. Ellis from 2 blocks over, clutching a folder of his own. "I don't want to get involved," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "But the man's out of control. Maybe this will help." Inside the folder were letters, receipts, and even a voice recording of Leonard berating him over a barely visible oil stain on his driveway. My father thanked him with a firm handshake. "You've helped more than you know," he said. Each statement was notarized and filed as a sworn affidavit. Piece by piece, the portrait of Leonard's tyranny was becoming undeniable. But evidence of harassment was just the surface. My father was after something deeper, something Leonard couldn't talk his way out of. He had a secret weapon Leonard could never have anticipated: access. My father wasn't just a homeowner. He had connections, people who specialized in peeling back layers of corruption. A friend from his years in public service introduced him to a digital forensics team that could retrieve deleted emails and track suspicious financial transactions. Another contact, a legal analyst with the county, offered to review HOA bylaws and state statutes to identify potential violations. "Start with the money," the analyst advised during a late-night phone call. "Tyrants like him always leave a trail when they think no one's watching." So they did. Through legal channels, my father requested access to public HOA records. Leonard scoffed when the notice arrived, thinking it was a routine audit. But weeks later, a subpoena landed on his desk, one he couldn't ignore. It demanded full disclosure of the HOA's financial statements, contractor invoices, and expense reports for the past 5 years. The results were explosive. Buried in the paperwork were payments to maintenance companies that didn't exist, invoices for landscaping jobs that were never performed, and transfers of thousands of dollars into accounts linked directly to Leonard's name. HOA dues, the money every homeowner paid in good faith, had been siphoned off into personal vacations, expensive electronics, and luxury dinners. "Unbelievable," my father whispered as he scrolled through the data one night. He highlighted line after line of suspicious transactions, his steady hands betraying just the slightest tremor of satisfaction. He thought no one would ever look. But as the case grew stronger, so did the risks. One night, as my father sorted through documents, headlights swept across our living room window. A car idled in front of the house longer than it should have. Then another night, we found muddy boot prints near the side gate, prints that didn't match ours. And once, when my father returned from a late meeting, he noticed a black sedan following a little too closely before disappearing down a side street. "Do you think it's him?" I asked, my voice tight. He didn't answer right away. "Paranoia is how men like Leonard stay in power," he said at last. "But facts are how we end them." Still, he doubled down on precautions. Cameras were upgraded. Important evidence was copied to secure cloud servers. Backup drives were stored in a safe deposit box. Nothing was left vulnerable. Weeks of meticulous work turned into months, and slowly the trap took shape. The file he compiled was no longer a simple complaint. It was a prosecutable case. Every incident was cross-referenced with state and federal statutes. Every piece of evidence was tied to a potential charge: trespassing, harassment, property destruction, mail tampering, and, most damning of all, embezzlement. And Leonard had no idea. At an HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse, he was his usual self, arrogant and dismissive, waving off complaints with condescending smiles. "We're all here to maintain standards," he said, leaning back in his chair as if he were a king on a throne. "And if certain residents feel those standards are too difficult, perhaps they should reconsider living here." A few uneasy glances flickered around the room. The tide of opinion was shifting, but Leonard couldn't see it. He was too drunk on power to notice that several board members were exchanging whispered conversations with my father in the hallway after meetings, or that copies of financial records were being quietly handed over. "Let him talk," my father said softly as we left one evening. The louder he gets, the harder he'll fall. The final step came when an investigator handed my father a slim folder late one afternoon. "You want to see this?" he said. Inside were screenshots of bank transfers showing Leonard funneling HOA funds into a private account under a shell company, one registered in his brother-in-law's name. It was the missing link that tied everything together. "This is it," my father breathed. "This is the nail in the coffin." He didn't rush to act. Instead, he spent several more days refining the timeline, cross-checking statements, and compiling exhibits. By the time he was done, the dossier was over 200 pages thick, a meticulous, airtight case that could withstand even the fiercest legal scrutiny. "This isn't revenge," he told me one night as he slid the final folder into the case file. "This is accountability." And then, with everything prepared, he made one more phone call, the most important of them all. "This is Special Investigations," the voice on the other end said. "How can we help you?" "I have information regarding financial misconduct, mail tampering, and criminal harassment within a homeowners association," my father replied. "And I have the evidence to prove it." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. "Then, we'll take it from here." The trap was now fully set. Every move Leonard had made was documented, every lie exposed, every crime tied to a statute. All that remained was the final step, springing it at the moment when Leonard least expected it. The day of the annual HOA meeting arrived with an unusual stillness that hung in the autumn air. The sun had just begun to sink behind the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and bruised purple, yet the streets were far from quiet. People moved with purpose, gathering in small clusters along the sidewalks, murmuring rumors they'd been trading for weeks. Some spoke of missing funds. Others whispered about mysterious complaints filed under false names. And still, others wondered aloud whether Leonard's reign over the neighborhood might finally be coming to an end. Inside the community hall, the tension was even thicker. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised wooden stage where a long table, draped in a deep green cloth, bore the seal of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. It was meant to project authority, but tonight it felt more like a courtroom. Leonard paced behind the podium, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit, every movement rehearsed and deliberate. He wore the smug smile of a man who believed he had already won. "Good evening, neighbors," he began, his voice booming through the microphone as if he were addressing a crowd far larger than the 100 or so residents in attendance. "I stand before you today proud of all we've accomplished. We've reduced crime, enforced order, and protected our property values. That is no small feat." Polite applause rippled through the room, though many hands remained still. My father and I sat near the back, silent observers. His posture was calm, almost too calm, like a man who knew something no one else did. He sipped his coffee slowly, eyes never leaving Leonard. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. Weeks of planning, gathering evidence, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Everything hinged on what would happen in the next hour. Leonard continued his speech, growing bolder with each word. Of course, not everyone appreciates the sacrifices leadership requires. Some people think they're above the rules. They tamper with security systems, refuse inspections, even spread lies about our board. But rest assured, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall burst open with a thunderous crack. Every head snapped around. A hush fell over the crowd as uniformed deputies strode in, boots echoing against the polished floor. At their head was my father, no longer the quiet man in the back row, but the sheriff in full authority. His deputies carried sealed evidence boxes marked with official tags, each one stacked high with documents, photographs, and hard drives. Leonard froze mid-sentence. What is this?" he stammered, his confident smile faltering for the first time. My father mounted the stage with unhurried steps, his expression unreadable. "Leonard Bishop," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're under investigation for multiple criminal offenses, including fraud, embezzlement, criminal mischief, false reporting, and impersonating a public official." A collective gasp swept through the room. Someone in the front row dropped their notebook. A woman clutched her husband's arm. Leonard's face drained of color. "This is outrageous," Leonard barked, his composure cracking. "I'm the president of this association. You have no right to interrupt a private meeting." "Actually," my father interrupted, holding up a court order, "we have every right. Signed by Judge Holloway this morning. Your authority ends here." The deputies set the evidence boxes on the table, and one of them handed my father a tablet. He nodded and gestured toward the projector screen behind Leonard. "Let's show them." The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. At first, there was nothing but the grainy view of a nighttime street. Then the camera shifted, revealing a familiar figure creeping through the shadows. Leonard. The footage showed him cutting the security wires on our property, prying open a mailbox with a screwdriver, and planting a fake violation notice on our door. Each frame was damning. Each second, another piece of his carefully built image crumbled. "That's Dr." Leonard shouted, sweat breaking across his forehead. "It's fake. Someone's trying to frame me." "Oh," my father said evenly. "Then maybe you can explain these." He nodded again, and the next slide appeared: bank records. Transfers from the HOA account to offshore holdings. Payments to shell companies with Leonard's signature on every authorization. Gasps grew louder. Neighbors turned to one another in disbelief. And then came the final blow: sworn affidavits from more than a dozen residents. Statements detailing how Leonard had pressured them, threatened fines, or fabricated violations unless they donated to special projects. Each testimony was signed and notarized, a mountain of evidence impossible to deny. Leonard's hand shook as he gripped the podium. "You can't do this to me," he whispered, though the microphone carried his words across the hall. "You don't understand. I built this neighborhood. Without me, it falls apart." "No," my father replied quietly, his gaze steady and cold. "Without you, it heals." As deputies moved toward him, Leonard's fear turned to fury. "This isn't over," he shouted, backing away from the stage's edge. "I know people, powerful people. They'll hear about this. You'll regret." He didn't finish. One deputy stepped forward and firmly took his arm. Another read him his rights as they snapped cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The man who had strutted into the hall like a king was now trembling as they led him down the aisle. The silence was deafening. Even the air felt still, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Just as Leonard reached the doors, a voice rose from the back. "Wait!" It was Mr. Grayson, one of Leonard's most loyal board members. He stood, shaking, holding a small black folder. "I have something else. I can't keep it quiet anymore." All eyes turned to him as he walked forward and handed the folder to my father. Inside were internal board emails, conversations where Leonard had discussed falsifying violation notices, intimidating residents, and even staging break-ins to justify increased HOA fees. The messages were time-stamped and undeniable. "Thank you," my father said, nodding once. "You just helped make sure justice is done." Leonard's face twisted in rage as he was dragged away. "You traitor!" he spat at Grayson, but the words fell flat. The man who had once ruled with fear and arrogance was now powerless, his empire collapsing piece by piece. When the doors finally closed behind him, silence lingered for several long seconds. Then my father stepped back to the podium and faced the stunned crowd. "I know many of you are shocked," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Some of you supported Leonard. Some of you feared him, and some of you felt powerless to stop him. But remember this: no one is above the law, not even an HOA president." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Slowly, he began to clap. One person, then another, until the hall erupted in applause. It wasn't the wild cheer of celebration, but the steady, relieved sound of people realizing they were free. In the weeks that followed, Oak Ridge Estates changed in ways no one could have imagined. A judge placed the HOA under temporary court supervision. Leonard's board was dissolved, and new elections were scheduled. This time, candidates promised transparency and accountability. Meetings were open to the public. Budgets were posted online. The draconian rules that had once governed every inch of our lives were rewritten with input from the very people they affected. For the first time in years, neighbors stopped avoiding each other. Barbecues returned to backyards. Kids played on the sidewalks without being scolded for riding too close to the curb. And every night, as porch lights flickered on one by one, there was a quiet sense of peace, the kind that comes when fear no longer rules a place. One crisp morning, I stepped outside to find my father sitting on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He looked out over the now peaceful street, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Feels different, doesn't it?" I asked, taking a seat beside him. He nodded. "It does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I thought back to everything Leonard had done, the threats, the lies, the power he had wielded like a weapon, and how quickly it had all vanished the moment the truth came out. "You know," I said after a while, "Leonard once told me someone had to be in charge around here." My father chuckled softly, setting his mug down. He was right about that. And as I watched him sit there, steady and unshaken, I realized he was. Someone was in charge here. It just wasn't Leonard. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and a strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a person's true power.